Thanks, Peg. I really appreciate it. I'm really happy to be here this afternoon. I'm going to be talking a little bit outside my comfort zone because most of the time I just talk about mobility and transportation. But I am going to be sharing with you all the results of a survey that my organization, along with a couple of others, was involved in this past year. Actually, it was a 2010 survey that was conducted to determine how well communities are prepared for the aging of the population. And I think as you listen to what I have to share, and I'm only going to be sharing some excerpts, I hope you'll be thinking about villages, your village in particular, and whether those things resonate with you, whether you're addressing some of the issues that are raised here, what maybe you need to be thinking about for the future and for future development as time goes on. So, Bernice, can you move the first slide? Let me tell you a little bit about the survey. The survey was originally conducted in 2005, and this survey in 2010 was sent to all cities and towns with a population size of 2,500 or greater. So not small towns, but cities that are in various sizes, all counties, and an online option was available for people to fill out the application. Over 10,000 localities got the survey, and those who did not respond were encouraged to respond. And we had a 14% response rate, which apparently is par for the course for a big survey like that. So the results I'm going to be sharing with you are based on about 1,400, a little over 1,400 responses. First of all, the issue about economic growth, and I think this is very telling, and I'm probably not going to say anything that surprises anybody in here. In 2010, there was some growth, but certainly less than there was in 2005. And there was some decline, and certainly more decline economically than there was in 2005. So the effects of the recession, of the economic downturn, were certainly felt by these localities, and that has an impact on their preparation for change and for the changing population. Next. The three top challenges changed in 2010. In 2005, and these are in order, the number one challenge was housing, second financial, third health. In 2010, I could probably have covered that up and everybody would have guessed that financial issues were going to be the number one concern. And it isn't personal financial issues per se, it's financial issues that municipalities and counties are struggling with to ensure infrastructure and services and the kinds of services that they need to have in place for the aging of the population. So number one, financial, and a new player in the group was transportation. That showed up as the number two challenge that was identified by the respondents to the survey. And the third challenge was housing, which had been number one in 2005. These are all the issues that are covered in the survey, and I should have kept hold of one of the copies of the executive summary. We have copies of the executive summary in the back, and the executive summary touches on all of the issues in the survey. If you want additional copies of the executive summary or you'd like a copy of the whole report, give me your card or your address at the end of this, or let Bernice know, and I'll be sure that you get a copy. We're more than happy to share it far and wide. So as you can see, the scope of the survey was very, very broad. Health, nutrition, exercise, transportation, public safety, housing, taxation and finance, workforce development, community and civic engagement, aging and human services, as well as strategic planning. So I'm only going to talk about a few of those trends. I think this is a very interesting chart because in these 5 areas, there was growth in 2010, except for one of them. So there was growth in the availability of specialized training for public safety and emergency staff. Considering the natural disasters that the United States has had between 2005 and 2010, you can understand why that would be true and why concerns for how to work with older people when there's an emergency is an important issue. Second, there was a slight increase in discounts for older adults to take classes. I think very good, an important recognition of the fact that people, when they retire, are often active, they want to stay engaged, and participating in education is a very important way that a lot of people stay engaged. It just kind of emphasizes the vitality of older people. On another note, in-home support services increased, but they increased only slightly. And that's a cause for concern because what we would have liked to have seen, I think, is a much bigger increase. Because as we know, older people and people who are getting older and their family members all want to stay in the community, which is one of the great strengths, I think, of the villages. And the need for supportive services to enable that to happen, especially as time goes on, is vitally important. Volunteer opportunities also increased, and I think that underscores the fact that older people are the prime volunteers in so many programs. Certainly within the Aging Network, from the very beginning of the AAA network and state units on aging, we have depended very heavily on volunteers to staff important functions, delivering home-delivered meals, providing grandparent relationships to children in school, providing services to their neighbors and friends, providing rides, very important role that older people play, and they are a part of the solution to many of these issues. But what's interesting is that property tax discounts that have been a long-standing tradition in many communities throughout the United States offered to older people declined. And I think, unfortunately, that's a reflection of governments having to tighten their belt and having to figure out where they can make an easy cut. And these things, obviously, were cut during this 5-year period. Unfortunately, that can have a profound impact on some people's ability to continue living in their homes, continue living in the community. Next slide. You have to hit it twice. Okay. So I just talked about these things, and we can go to the next slide because I basically covered the details while we were looking at the chart. Okay, I want to say a few words about transportation, obviously my own passion, my own bent in this thing. In the Maturing of America survey in 2010, we found that transportation issues emerged as a major challenge. And it was a recognition on the part of these communities nationwide that if people are going to live in the community, if they're going to live and thrive, the need to ensure that there's the ability for people to get around, that they're not isolated in their homes, that becomes of tremendous importance. Now, there's a lot of information on this slide. I'm going to spend a couple of minutes talking about it. We start out with the availability of a sidewalk system that links where people live to where public transportation is. We know that in many communities in the suburbs around D.C., if you are headed for a bus stop in some places, you can't walk to the bus stop on the sidewalk. You have to walk on the grass. And unfortunately, in some cases, you have to actually get into the street to get to it. Highly dangerous, and that means that, okay, there's a bus stop in the neighborhood, isn't that great? But I can't get to it, so what good does it do me? The other issue, safe and accessible sidewalks and street crossings. There have been a number of municipalities around the country that have looked at safe walking routes. The city of Miami in Florida did a survey of downtown Miami and identified the 10 most dangerous street corners. And they did that in order to, one, work with municipal authorities to see what you could do to ameliorate some of those issues. Sometimes there's a stoplight, but the crosswalk is away from where the curb cut is, so they don't always line up. Sometimes the amount of time that you have to cross the street, they're timed by how long it takes for the cars to get through the traffic. They're not necessarily timed by how long it takes you to walk. So those kinds of things become important to consider when you're talking about mobility in older people. I'm going to skip mobility management for a second and I'm going to come back to it. Older driver safety training. There is a researcher in senior transportation named Sandra Rosenblum who is famous for her non-seculars. And she basically says that there is no way that we will ever have enough transportation resources to transport every older person. No way. We depend on people continuing to drive and to drive safely. And as a matter of fact, we are a car culture in this country, and we need to recognize that. And that's no more true for a younger person than it is for an older person. Giving up the keys is a major life change. It has a profound impact on people's lives. You're 15% less likely to be able to get to the doctor. You're about 59% less likely to be able to get to shopping. And you're 65% less likely to be able to participate in social activities. Go to the movies, have dinner with friends, visit a friend or a relative, go to church, go to synagogue. All those things that make life worth living decline inevitably if you stop driving. Yet, there are people who recognize that they need to stop driving. About 600,000 older people every year voluntarily stop driving. And a lot more people, we don't have a good number for that, modify their driving. They don't drive on highways, or they don't drive at night, or they don't cross certain intersections. So there's a lot that people do personally to ensure that they're as safe as possible. And there are ways to strengthen people's driving ability. There are computer programs that are designed to help people's reaction time increase, that have a proven track record, that are evidence-based. And there are situations, however, when it isn't just the person who's driving, but it's also roads and signage and the visibility of signs and the stoplights and so forth. All of those accommodations that we made several years ago in the early 90s and late 80s to accommodate people with disabilities by putting curb cuts in our streets, they don't just benefit people with disabilities, they benefit all of us. They make it easier for all of us to walk around. They make it easier for moms with strollers to be able to push the stroller across the street. They benefit us all. And there are things that can be done with roadways that can benefit us all. So as you look at these bars, you can see that older driver safety training and road design are things that exist in many of these municipalities, but not so many. Not even half of them report that they have these things available. So I think that's important to consider. Then there's a whole laundry list of different kinds of transportation. We live in the DC metro area in a place that has a rich resource of transportation. But what is interesting to me is that when you read the Dr. Gridlock articles, which I frequently do and find amusing often, you read about the barriers that people encounter in using transportation, even in an area like DC. There are places that are not well served by transit, or you can't get to it. Or you could get to it, but you can't now. And there are a lot of people who have never used transit, who are not comfortable with it. And with older people, while public transit is required to offer a paratransit option, there are a lot of older people who don't need paratransit. They're not in wheelchairs. They're not even using walkers. They may not even be using canes. But they may be unsteady on their feet. They may not be able to walk more than a block or two. And for folks like that, they need alternative kinds of transportation. Sometimes an arm to lean on. Sometimes, if you're going to some places, you can actually walk there, but other places you can't. So transportation is a very individual issue. Everybody's needs are different, and they change with the situation, with where they're going, and with how they can get there. A very important part of consideration for municipalities and counties to prepare for the aging of our citizenry, and also a very important issue that I know that the villages are well aware of and are doing many things to respond to those issues. Couple of things I would say. One is the solution is not always to buy a bus or a van. There are lots of community organizations that work on transportation. So my advice to any organization that is trying to figure out how to better serve the transportation needs of their clients is always to find out who else is doing this, who else is already involved, who can we partner with, who can we work with, so that we're not reinventing the wheel and we're not creating yet another bus that sits idle for hours because our clients are not using them. How can we be part of the solution and part of a community-wide effort to ensure that transportation is provided? The other issue is get involved in planning. Every locality in the country, in order to get federal transportation dollars, has to have a coordinated public transit human services plan. And that plan is supposed to include participation of the citizenry. Older people, people with disabilities, poor people, people who are likely to use the services. So it's a real opportunity for civic engagement and to ensure that the voice of older people and the people who care about them is heard. So I urge you to get involved. Next slide. So moving on to other topics, exercise programs. Local parks and venues, places to walk are very important. Those are important for long-lasting health, for vitality, for participation in the life of the community. Also exercise programs related to people's specific health conditions. Again, you'll see that those are far less available than the availability of local parks. What's surprising to me is that the respondents to the survey, that it wasn't 100%, that there weren't in every community places where people could walk and where they could have recreation. Next slide. Public safety. I talked about that a little bit. I'm not going to say much more, except that I think it's a real issue that villages need to be thinking about in terms of the long-term health and well-being of the people who are members of the village. Not to reinvent the wheel, but to connect with the public emergency folks. That's something that area agencies on aging around the country increasingly are doing. They're working very closely with the emergency people. It's also an evacuation people. When evacuation has to happen, how are people going to be transported? If you don't have your own car, will somebody check on neighbors and friends to get them out of there? That was certainly one of the more egregious situations in New Orleans in Hurricane Katrina, where a lot of people just simply could not get out. And don't forget the pets. That becomes a very important emergency situation. Some of the accounts of Hurricane Katrina make it clear that people who could have gone to safety chose not to because they were concerned about their beloved dog or cat. And I think a lot of us can really understand that. It's also very important to know what the danger signs of elder abuse and neglect are. To connect with the public Adult Protective Services program or elder abuse program to ensure that you're knowledgeable about what the danger signs are and how to report when there's a problem and how to get somebody to be helpful in a situation that looks like it's sliding downhill. Next slide. Housing programs. Again, these are not available everywhere, and I think very important issues, not just subsidized housing, but also the issue about services that help people live in their homes. Not so much an issue in the DC metro area. We have public trash pickup in most places and don't really have to worry about things like that. But in some municipalities, some towns, some counties, that becomes a major issue. And again, it's a major issue that can cause somebody not to be able to live independently anymore. The ability to modify existing houses, certainly that's been a personal issue for me in the last couple of years. My mom broke her hip visiting me 2 years ago in the fall, and when she went home, the only way she was going to be able to get out in her wheelchair was with a ramp, so we had to put a ramp in the house. That's a big, big issue. Without that ramp, she would not have been able to stay at home. And that would have broken all of our hearts, as you can imagine. So the ability to modify homes. But the other issue is thinking about home modification, not just as major home modifications, but there are so many things that can be done to make a home livable. Just putting in a couple of grab bars, figuring out how to widen the doorway, those kinds of things that can enable older people to stay in their homes. And also to be able to have access to home repair and maintenance, which can be a real challenge for a homeowner at any age. But certainly as people get older, especially as family members or their spouse, handy person is no longer there. And so it's dependent on them to screw in the light bulbs in the ceiling that's 9 feet high, or to take the air conditioner out when the fall comes. Those kinds of things can really make or break somebody's ability to live independently. Next slide. I think it's very important to also remember that older people are not just people who need services and supports. Older people are people who contribute to their community. I talk a little bit about the volunteer opportunities that have grown. I think we're also entering a period with the baby boomers, and I'm one of them, getting into old age, and the fact that some of the models of volunteering are changing. And it's important to figure out how people can be engaged, people who are working into their 60s and 70s and even 80s, who still have time that they would want to give, who are still willing to volunteer. How can they be involved? People who don't necessarily want to be the volunteer who gives 200 hours a month to Meals on Wheels, but who has a few hours to give here and there, and may 1 month want to work on home-delivered meals, and another month may want to give people rides. So figuring out how to accommodate people to ensure that we're maximizing opportunities. Because I think I started out my presentation saying that the Aging Network has certainly always depended greatly on volunteers. And I think we all need to think outside the box. We also need to figure out how to give people volunteer opportunities that are meaningful and exciting and stimulating. It isn't just, we need you to do this. It's, what are you going to get out of it? Are you going to enjoy it? Does it speak to you? Is it something that makes you feel fulfilled? Because I think a lot of people really depend on their volunteer activities to help them feel part of the community. Next slide. I also think that, and this is another thing that the survey found, there are a relatively small number of these communities that said that they had a single entry point for aging services. And what that means is that if you need to find out about where you can get a ride, or who you might be able to contact to get a home health aide in your home, or who has information about a wide variety of issues, that in many communities, it's really difficult to figure this out. And after maybe 5 calls or 7 calls, you might actually be able to find the resource that you're looking for. I think that's one of the more creative and wonderful things that villages do, because they recognize the difficulty that people encounter. If you have never run into this kind of problem before in your life, why should you know where to go? I work in aging, and it surprises me sometimes that there might be some issue that I scratch my head and I'm like, now where would I call to get this answer? One answer is the Elder Care Locator, which I assume everyone is familiar with. It's operated by my agency, N4A. It's funded by the Administration on Aging. And it provides information on a very broad array of issues. And basically its philosophy is to connect people directly to the local information agency for information, so that you get information about local services that are available in your community. There is variety around the country. It's the Elder Care Locator. And it's, I'm going to embarrass myself sharing, it's 1-800-8... Thank you. 1-800-677-1116 is the toll-free number. And it will connect you to your local area agency on aging or your local aging and disability resource center. The other issue that I talked about earlier is this availability of in-home support service and chore service. Again, not available everywhere, which means that people are finding solutions where they can. They're hiring a neighbor or friend. They're finding somebody in the phone book. There isn't necessarily any formal services that are available. And the respondents to the Maturing of America survey talked about not just what's available through local government, but what's generally available to older people. Some of these services may be available in the public sector, but if you have money to pay for them, there may be no place for you to purchase this service. I mean, that can be a real issue in some communities. And some people can really spend a lot of money trying to get access to these kinds of services. Okay. Strategic planning. My only word on this is it's important for older people to get involved as citizens in planning. If your area agency on aging is developing a plan, which it does every 4 years, you need to let folks know that the villages are part of the community. And older people, the Aging Network targets people who are most economically and socially needy. but it provides a lot of services to all older people, and it's important to make connections, I think, between the villages and the aging network. Go on. There's also the issue about things that can be barriers that you don't normally think about. Building codes, zoning that can make it impossible for you to get access to like an accessory apartment or to make modifications to your home. One of the things that the survey found was that there are examples of communities that are waiving fees for making minor repairs to your home. That can make a big difference to a lot of older people on fixed incomes. Next slide. These are just some examples of local initiatives. One small city in Iowa, which is looking at putting an emphasis on buildings and homes where people can actually age in place. Next slide. A town in Connecticut called Voluntown, interestingly enough, that has an ordinance, just what I was talking to you about, an ordinance in place that allows older citizens to get permits to do repairs without having to pay application fees. In Sarasota, Florida, they're working on creating a community for a lifetime. What can they do to make sure that people can live, walk down the street, get access to public transportation, get their homes repaired and modified so that they can remain in that community for as long as they live. Next slide. In summary, obviously the recession has had a negative impact on communities nationwide, and that impacts the availability of programs, cutbacks in services, and things that inevitably will have a negative impact on older people. Population size of community makes a difference. We live in a large metropolitan area, and we have access to a much richer array of services that is available in smaller towns and cities across the country. And finally, this survey found that the private sector is not playing a major role in delivering services and programs to older adults. At least according to the local government officials who responded to the survey, they're not aware of a lot of private services that are stepping up to the plate. I think it's an opportunity for entrepreneurship. I think it's an opportunity for engaging the interest on the part of the private sector that older people are a major consumer group of many kinds of services, and we really need to do a better job of that. And non-profit and faith-based organizations are most often identified as partners in service delivery. And I think that's my last slide. Oh, one more. Community sustainability depends on putting in place now services and programs that are going to enable that community to be prepared for the future. So the time actually is yesterday for us to work on these things. We really need to think broadly, think way into the future, think about what we can do creatively. Thank you.